So many people in the world that we live in today are what we call contract laborers. So a contract laborer is someone that generally they work for an individual, not all the time, but an example would be a painter, a house painter. So a house painter is a contract laborer because, say, a homeowner, let's say if I want to get the exterior of my house painted and I don't want to do it. So what I do is I contact painters that are contract laborers. And what they will do is they will come out to my house, they will look over the scope of the job, and then they will write out for me a bid, right? And so it says, well, we're going to do this with this quality paint, and we're going to paint this and this and this and this and this, and here's what the amount is that we're going to charge. As the homeowner, I can either agree or disagree with their bid. I can accept it or not. If I accept the bid, then that painter and myself, we have a contract. They're not my employee because the next week they're going to go work for somebody else, and the next week they're going to go work for somebody else. That's called a contract labor. They work contract to contract to contract. The most well-known contract laborers in America are professional athletes. We know more about them and their contracts than we really do everybody else. And so a professional athlete, generally what happens is this. So we start back to maybe a kid that just graduated college. They get drafted by a team, and then they hire an agent. And the agent negotiates a contract with that team. And if it's agreed upon by everyone, the player signs the contract, and what that contract basically says is, I'm going to play for this team, and I'm going to play this position, and I'm going to then also be compensated this amount. It's all in the contract. And then many of the professional athlete contracts have incentive clauses in them. And so what that means is they have a base pay that's in the contract, and that's what they're going to get paid. But if they meet certain benchmarks, they can make more money in the contract. So for example, maybe it's a rookie NFL player. And so one of the incentive clauses might be if he starts 10 games of the 16 games. If he starts 10 games, then he gets a bonus of this much. Or for any player, if they get voted on as an all-star at the end of the season or in the middle of the season, then they get an incentive bonus of this much. And so there's all different types of incentives based on performance. In 2013, the San Francisco 49ers signed a young man by the name of Terrell Brown to a contract to play cornerback for their team. It was a one-year contract, and it's important that you listen to the numbers here. Not because they're so big, because actually in football they're not that big. But his contract was to pay him $2,925,000. $2,925,000 to play cornerback for one season. But he didn't read the contract. And if his agent actually read it, he neglected to tell Terrell Brown about something that was written in it. Terrell Brown chose not to participate in the voluntary off-season workout program, which was a $2 million bonus of the $2,925,000 contract. Now, trust me, he didn't go hungry, right? But he left $2 million on the table because he didn't know what was in the contract. When you work on a contract basis, one of the reasons that people like to work on a contract basis is because you know you have the ability to understand what your expectations are. And many people prefer to work under that clearly written contract because they know what they have to do in order to be rewarded. Many Christians like the idea of serving God under a contract because they know what they have to do in order for God to bless them. But is that really how God wants us to serve Him? Truth is, many Christians do serve God that way. They want to work off the contract, and it is, at least in our mind, it's an option. But there's another option. And it's actually the option that God prefers for us to follow Him by and to serve Him by. So when it comes to serving God, we can either live under a contract of works, or we can live in the comfort of grace. Those are two far ends of the spectrum. So we can either live under the contract of works or the comfort of grace. Today I want to bring a message that's titled The Fallacy of the Prosperity Gospel, and it comes from the parable of the vineyard workers. All summer we've been working through the parables of Jesus, and I'm sure that you kind of have an idea of what the prosperity gospel is, because it has to do with prospering. It's the idea that God is obligated to prosper us, to bless us with health and wealth and all types of good things if we do good things for Him. And today, what you're going to get to see is the first Christian who realized that Jesus didn't believe in the prosperity gospel. Because the truth is it's no gospel at all. It's a false gospel. So let's begin here in the parable of the vineyard workers, Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. I want to stop here because I'm going to address this in the parable that it is. But please remember this. We're not talking about a landowner. We're talking about Jesus, okay? For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. So Jesus is using this illustration of a vineyard and a man that owns it that's hiring laborers. And so that verse says that he went out early in the morning because that's what you had to do. The Hebrew work day began at 6 in the morning and it ended at 6 in the evening. So it was a 12-hour work day. Verse 2. He, the landowner, agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. Now, something I want you to see here. It says that the landowner agreed. If I come to you and try to negotiate something with you, I'm instigating it, and you can either agree or disagree. What I want you to see we'll do in many places here, as we kind of read between the lines, these workers are the ones that instigated the contract. They told the man, yes, we will work for you today, but here's what we want. We want a denarius, which is a full day's pay. Now, I'm just going to throw out a dollar figure here, because let's just say that maybe for someone to just go out and work in the vineyard, so just a day laborer, $15 an hour. So what they're saying is we're going to go and we'll work 12 hours. You pay us $180. That's the contract. And he said, done deal, glad to pay it. So these workers, they've agreed to a works-based contract. But in order for us to fully grasp what's going to happen in this parable, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a pause, and we're going to leave the parable, because to really get it, we need to go back one chapter, Matthew chapter 19, because we need to see what the context is of this parable. Why is Jesus speaking this parable? So in Matthew chapter 19, I'm not going to read it all to you, I'll just paraphrase it. So a rich man came to Jesus, and he said to Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, knowing this man's heart and knowing he was very wealthy, he told the man, go sell all your possessions and then come and follow me. Now, is Jesus saying that the way to heaven is to sell your possessions? No, that's not it at all. The way to heaven is to come and follow Jesus. But Jesus knew that there was something in this man's life that was going to come before that, and it was his wealth and his possessions. And so Jesus let him know. Jesus already knew, but he let this man answer for himself what his priorities were. And his priorities were his wealth and his possessions. And he wasn't willing to do that. And so that man went away not following Jesus. But here's another place where we read between the lines. Peter and all the other disciples, they're there and they hear this conversation. They heard Jesus tell this rich man that he was going to have to sell his possessions and follow Jesus. And right then, it hit Peter. We're never going to be rich following Jesus. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to you. It might not be any big eureka moment. But here's the thing. The Jewish people of that day believed that being rich proved that God was showing favor to people. Does that sound familiar? Because that's still going on today, right? For some. They believed that wealth was evidence of God's blessing. And they based this on the fact that at the very beginning of their history, when they were just an infant nation, God told them in Deuteronomy chapter 28, he said to the infant nation of Israel, if you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, then you will experience loss. If you take that and package that into modern day Christianity, that's what's called the prosperity gospel. That if you perform certain good works, God will bless you. And you will experience his hand of favor on you. And you will experience good health and great wealth. And Peter is the first person in the history of Christianity who had that light bulb moment when he realized that Jesus doesn't operate according to the prosperity gospel. And that following Jesus doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to prosper in this life. And once it hits Peter that following Jesus doesn't mean earthly prosperity, I mean, you have to think about this for a little bit. That's all Peter has known. All Peter has known as a Jewish man is obey God, things go well for you. Disobey God, things go bad. That's all he's ever known. And all of a sudden, he's like, oh, with Jesus, it doesn't work that way. His mind is running 100 miles an hour, wondering, so what does it mean then to follow Jesus now? And so he asks Jesus a question in Matthew chapter 19, verse 27. After Jesus finishes the story about the rich man, Peter answered him, well, Jesus, we've left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us? Let me paraphrase what Peter just said. Jesus, we've been following you and serving you. What's in it for us? How are you going to reward us? How are you going to prosper? We've left everything for you. There's got to be something in it for us. You got to be. That's all we've known. Jesus, God had said, back in the Old Testament law, if we do good, He'll bless us. How does this work with you, Jesus? See, Peter wanted to continue to live under the prosperity gospel, which is nothing more than a contract of works. If you do this, we'll go back to the painter. You do this, I'll pay you this. The prosperity gospel is a contract of works with Jesus. Jesus, if I do this, you're obligated to do this. That's the contract. See, Israel had lived under that contract of works since its infancy as a nation. And I keep using that word infancy, because when you think about it for a second, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Isn't that how you begin to train infants and small children? If they do good things, you give them a treat. You reward them. If they do bad things, maybe you discipline them. Let's be real. Every one of you parents, at one time or another, even though you don't want other people to know this, you bribed your children in the car right before you got out to go in the grocery store. Right? You told your kids, maybe your kids were being especially bad little hellions on that day, and you'd had all you could take, and so you bargained with them. Listen, if you'll just be good, because you could see you already had this picture of your child being the one screaming down the aisle in the grocery store. And because they were a small child, you had this idea, I'll throw that carrot out the end of the stick down there. And you told them, if you'll be good while mommy or daddy is in the grocery store, when we get to the checkout counter, you can get a reward. You can get a piece of candy. So let's tie all this together. Living under a contract of works, this rewarding good behavior in the short term, when you take that and put that into modern day Christianity, that is the definition of the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel says, if you do good, you get rewarded now. If you be a good boy, you get a piece of candy. If you be a good girl, you get a piece of gum. What that means is there's really no other way for me to say it than this. The prosperity gospel is for children. It's for immature Christians who want their bubble gum from God immediately after being good. And that's what Peter wanted to know about. What's in it for us, Jesus? What do we get and when? And Jesus gave him this answer. So 27, Peter says, we've left everything to follow you. What then is there going to be for us? Verse 28, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus told Peter, he said, Peter, there is a reward for following and serving me. But the reward that you're going to get is not something that you're going to see on this earth. It's something that you're going to get to see when eternity is ushered in, when there's a new heaven and a new earth created. See, prosperity gospel Christians, they do what they do thinking that their efforts or their offerings or their good works, whatever they do to serve the Lord, is a short-term sacrifice that will be rewarded in the short term, in this life. And that brings me to the main point of today's message, which is this. Following and serving God isn't a short-term sacrifice. It's a long-term investment. It's not, we don't do it for the short term. We follow and serve God because it's a long-term investment. That's what Jesus is teaching Peter. Our motive for serving God isn't so that he will prosper us in this life. And that's the difference in maturity, spiritual maturity, and spiritual immaturity. Immaturity is only willing to make short-term sacrifices with God paying us back, prospering us quickly to make it worth our while. But those who are spiritually mature realize that serving the Lord isn't something that we do for the short term. It's a long-term investment. We're following God for the long haul. You see, the spiritually immature, those who are in it for the short term, they want their blessing, they want their prosperity from God sooner rather than later. They want to get the return first, not last. And that's what Peter's thinking. Peter's thinking, I want to get mine now, not way later. I want to get my reward first, not last. And so Jesus says this in that same chapter, Matthew 19, verse 30. Jesus says, but many who are first will be last, and those who are last will be first. That was all introduction. And now we get to jump in to the parable, right? So Jesus speaks the parable of the vineyard workers to help Peter and the disciples, and us as well, understand better how God rewards, how God prospers those who serve him. And he points out the contrast of serving God under that contract of works versus the comfort of grace. So we read verses 1 and 2. The landowner goes out and he hires a shift of workers to work a 12-hour day. They said, we'll work for you, but we want to work under this contract, 12 hours for a full day's pay. And he agreed. Now let's pick up in that parable, Matthew chapter 20, verse 3. Now about 9 in the morning, that landowner went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And he told them, you also go work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. Do you see the difference? The first group said, we'll work for you, but we want a contract. This group didn't do that. They trusted, they put their faith in the graciousness of the landowner. And he said, okay, go to work, and I'll pay you whatever's right when the day's over. So they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. And he asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. And he said to them, you also go work in my vineyard. So that last group, he said that he hired them at 5. What time does the workday end? 6. So they're just going to work 1 hour. So this landowner has hired 5 shifts of people. The first shift he hired under a contract, 12 hours for a day's pay. And again, I'm giving you the dollar figure of $15 an hour, so $180. Those other 4 shifts, they didn't work under contract. They just trusted the grace of the landowner because he said, I'll pay you what's right. So the first shift works 12 hours, the second shift works 9, the third shift works 6, the fourth shift works 3, and the fifth shift works 1 hour. And those last 4 shifts had no contract. Verse 8. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." And the workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. You remember how much the denarius is, right? Full day's pay. So he sets the contract with that first shift that's going to work 12 hours for a full day's pay, $180. This last group that worked only 1 hour comes to the foreman, and they pay them $180. Verse 10. So when those came who were hired first, the contract workers, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. And when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. Those who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. I feel like I need to read this part with a little whiny voice, because that's not fair. We worked all day and it was hot, and they only worked an hour, and it wasn't even as hot from 5 to 6, and they didn't even sweat any, and it didn't work as hard. And we have blisters, and they don't still have a manicure. You paid them $180, and we worked all day, and you only paid us $180. That whining makes me want to spank my children. Verse 13. But he answered one of them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Those who were hired last, if they would have insisted upon a contract of works, they would have gotten paid $15. But instead, they put their faith in the grace of the landowner, and they got paid an entire day's wage. They worked 1 hour and got paid for 12. And when the ones who worked 12 hours came to get paid, they were doing the math in their head. They got 12 hours for one, and we worked 12 hours, multiply that times 12. They were thinking, we're about to bank, baby. They assumed that they were going to get more than those who worked 1 hour, but they got exactly what they contracted for, and they were not happy about it. And they protested. We deserve more than they do. We worked longer, harder, and in the heat of the day. This isn't fair. Do you know that every worker who worked by faith in the grace of the landowner, do you know they all left happy that day? The only ones who left unhappy were the ones who agreed to the contract of works. I want to share with you very quickly this morning 3 things that stand out in this parable. The first is this: the more undeserving we think we are, the more gracious we think God is. It doesn't say this in the Bible, but I think it was meant for us to assume that all of the part-time shifts received the 12-hour pay for the amount of time that they worked. So when the workers that had worked 9 hours got paid for 12, they knew they didn't deserve it, but they were only getting 3 extra hours of pay, so they were happy about it. When those that worked 6 hours got paid for 12 hours, they knew that they were getting paid double what they were worth, and they were really happy. When those who worked only 3 hours got paid for 12, they were ecstatic about the gracious pay from the landowner. And when those who only worked 1 hour got paid for 12, they couldn't contain themselves. This was the most kind, awesome, and gracious landowner they'd ever heard of, much less worked for. You see, the more undeserving they thought they were, the more gracious they thought the landowner was. I remind you, we're not talking about a landowner, right? See, the more undeserving we think we are, the more gracious we think God is. And in this parable, those who felt undeserving and felt the landowner was gracious, they also, in relation to the amount that he was gracious to them, they also took that much more delight in the landowner. Second thing that stands out is this: the more deserving we think we are, the more resentful we become of God's grace to others. The workers who were hired under contract got exactly what they agreed to. But here's the kicker about those who choose to live according to works. They begin to develop a sense of entitlement. What I mean by that is God, I've done this, you owe me. God, I've been good. God, I've given offerings. God, I've served. God, I've done this. Now, you have to do this for me. The contract workers here in the parable, they got mad and they told the landowner, we expected to get more than what we agreed to. They were resentful of those who are the recipients of his grace, even though they got exactly what they bargained for. See, when people choose to live according to the prosperity gospel, when they see other people who aren't serving God as good as they think they are, or maybe they haven't served as long, they get resentful. And often what happens is those people, they get disgusted with God and they wander away. See, that's one of the fallacies of the prosperity gospel. We get to expecting that God owes us, that he's obligated to us, and when God doesn't do the things we want him to do, it's easy for people just to wander away. See, when we live under the works philosophy, we begin to think that we're more deserving than we really are. But we need to understand this, ladies and gentlemen. God is never obligated to us. God's kingdom doesn't operate on the currency of good works. So let me make up a hypothetical story to make a point. So hypothetically, my wife is gone for a week, and I miss her, and I haven't done a very good job of keeping the house clean and straight, and so there's dishes in the sink and stuff's kind of thrown around everywhere. And I'm trying to think of how can I let her know how much I love her, how much I've missed her, and what can I do so that when she comes in, she is able to acknowledge how important she is to me. So I'm trying to think of what do I do, and then I do what I might do on my day off is I watch the Andy Griffith Show. And on that day, there's an episode where Aunt Bee is gone for a week. And Andy and Opie live like two pigs in a pigsty. And it's awful. And Andy begins to think, I can't let Aunt Bee come home to this. She's been on vacation, and so they go on this cleaning spree, and they just clean the house spick and span. And Aunt Bee is about to come home, and she's thinking to herself how helpless Andy and Opie are, how much they need her, and how the house is going to be a disaster and all that. And when she walks in the door, the house is all clean, and she feels like she's not needed. So I tell myself, I don't want Lynn to not feel needed. And so I leave all the dirty dishes everywhere, and I go in the laundry room, and I get all my dirty clothes, and I throw all my dirty laundry all over the house. And when she comes in the door, I'm so proud that she's going to just feel so important and so loved and missed, and I'm going to get so much favor with her. And she walks in and she looks at me and she does that thing that wives and moms do. You know? And I tell her, I said, baby, I wanted you to know how much I love you, and I want to have favor with you, so I've thrown all my dirty laundry out here. And she looks at me like I have lost my ever-living mind, right? Anybody see where I'm going with this? Isaiah 64:6 says, all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. See, God's kingdom doesn't work on a currency of works, because our works are nothing but trying to get God's favor by throwing out our dirty laundry everywhere. And God says, that doesn't do it for me. And when we try to live in God's kingdom by works instead of by grace, we get to thinking we deserve more than what God is doing for us. And that statement brings me to the third thing that stands out in this parable. It's this: do we really want God to give us what we deserve? I realize that living by grace can at times be a little uncomfortable and a little unsettling, because it's a whole lot easier if we know what the contract says, right? If I do this, then God does this. If I do this, then God does this. But do we really want to forego living in the comfort of grace to live under a contract of works where God gives us what we deserve? I don't. And here's why. If I live by grace, the very least I will get from God is what I deserve. That's the very least. But it contains the possibility that God in His grace is going to give me way more than I deserve. And that's what I want to challenge you to today. I want to challenge us all today. Let's grow up. Let's mature spiritually. Let's grow past the prosperity gospel. Listen, here's the deal. We all need to be a little honest. We all have at least a smidge of the prosperity gospel in us. We don't want to think we do, but we all have just a little bit. Some have a little more. But all of us kind of have a little bit of this attitude of, well, if I do this, then God should do this. But we need to choose to live in the comfort of grace, not under the contract of works where God gives us what we deserve. So let's grow up. Let's mature spiritually. Let's grow past the prosperity gospel that sells short-term reward like bubble gum at the checkout counter, and realize that serving God means that we're in it for the long haul. It's an investment in eternal things which will bring a reward. But the reward that Jesus tells us that we're getting is not in this life. It's in the next. Now, I'm not saying that following Christ can't be rewarding this life, because it can and it is. But that's not the motive for why we serve and follow God, for what we get now. We're investing in eternity, and our reward will be in eternity. And so let's serve and follow God and live in the comfort of His grace, not in the contract of works. Peter was the first Christian to figure out that Jesus didn't operate by the prosperity gospel. Some people still haven't figured it out 2,000 years later. Don't be one of those. Don't live under a contract of works. Don't live choosing to get only what you deserve. The teaching of the parable of the vineyard workers is we can trust God to be gracious to us and give us more than we deserve if we'll just trust Him. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me this morning? This isn't, or I should say, these aren't just truths for me to teach, for you to know. These aren't truths just for you to store in your memory bank of Christian principles. This is meant to change how we approach everything when it comes to following and serving God. Not just so that we'll be better people, but so that we will be a reflection of Jesus to a lost world. I can promise you, you don't want to live getting what you deserve. You want to live in the comfort of His grace. So we got to grow up. We got to mature. We got to get past this false prosperity gospel that God is obligated to give us something now in return for what we do. But to understand that walking with Jesus is a long-term investment. And so we got to be faithful. And I challenge you and I encourage you to be faithful. Heavenly Father, may these truths change who we are and change our life and change the way we live. God, it's so easy for all of us to slide back into this, God, if I'll do this for you, you should do this for me thing. And that's not how you want us to live. You don't want us to live under a contract of works, but you want us to put our faith and trust in you so that you can treat us with grace. So God, help us to commit to maturing spiritually and to be in it for the long haul and to trust you in all things. And I ask this in Jesus' name.